So we basically, in all of our polling across the country, are seeing a political climate that's moved about 5 or 6 points to the left. The winner of the North Carolina Senate race is going to be determined much more by how people are feeling about Donald Trump than how they're feeling about Roy Cooper. I think Wally is very much just like a generic Republican.
Welcome on in to another edition of Tying Together with Tim Boyum. I am Tim Boyum here with Mr. John McHugh, producer extraordinaire. How are you, John?
Good. Nice restful weekend finally, and doing pretty well.
Got to get those beach, but finally no rain. The summer's been
Finally.
wild.
We've been trying to go to the beach for like a month.
I know. Hey, so the Senate race is like all we can talk about. I know there are other things going on, but this thing is so fascinating already, and we're still 15 months out. But we got some polls that they're kind of interesting, right? I mean, they're Cooper's ahead, but
yeah, they're interesting in their variety. They're a little bit all over the place, But yeah, I mean, I think traditional wisdom would tell you that these numbers you might think they should be a little bit higher for Roy Cooper, but you'll hear in our guest today, you hear what he says and you go, oh, no, no, you're right. That makes sense.
Yeah, kind of makes sense. Speaking of our guest, Tom Jensen with Public Policy Polling, longtime friend of the program. Yes, it's a Democratic pollster, but his polls have ranked right up there at the top. Often they're right there with the Carolina Journal poll, which is a conservative pollster here with the John Locke Foundation as well. He's been with them since 2007. He's a Michigan native, UNC Chapel Hill grad. And John, I am most mystified. For those of you who don't know, and Tom, I hope you don't hate me saying this, but he came off of a flight where he got in at like 4 a.m. and he still did this interview with us like 5 hours later. His ability to rattle off numbers from like 20 years ago it's insane.
Yeah, just always so smart and so sharp that regardless of how little sleep he got the night before, it's wildly impressive.
I mean, it's unbelievable. However, it will give us great insight about where this race is and where it's likely to end November of 2026. 15 months from now, we may know now where this race is going to end, which is wild. Here's Tom Jensen. First of all, it's great to see you. I do have to start with this, non-political. What do you think about this? So Belichick is coming up here. I know you're a huge UNC guy. What do you make of the Belichick era?
Well, I think that certainly he's created a lot of buzz and excitement for the program, and that usually has a pretty good impact on things. And certainly we saw, for instance, with like Deion Sanders, that non-traditional college football coaches can take programs to levels that have had to levels that are more successful than they've had in the recent past. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it'll be a good season.
That's what's so weird about this. It's hard to tell whether it's going to be good or bad this season because there's just so many new players. It's going to be wild, but the attention can't be bad, as you said. So
it's definitely going to be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking of interesting, the Senate race is it's been all over the place this year. Let's start with Tom Tillis. I've talked to his folks who have said, look, he could have won. I've talked to grassroots folks who say there's no way he could have won. I think most other people think it would have been ridiculously close. What do you think were his odds if he stayed in?
I think that he would have been a little bit of an underdog for re-election. We definitely found that he had very poor approval numbers. He tended to have about a 25% approval rating, about 45% disapprove. And that leaves another 30%. And that's actually an interesting thing for the whole last 17 years that I've been doing this job. We've tended to have senators who are a little bit nondescript to voters in the state. There were always a lot of people who had no opinion about Kay Hagan and Richard Burr. There's a lot of people who have no opinion about Ted Budd, and the same sort of thing with Tillis. But to the extent that people did have an opinion, it tended not to be a very positive one. And what really drove down his numbers was having less than 50% approval with Republicans. And even though I think most of those Republicans would have ended up voting for him next year, I think a big question is if over half of Republicans didn't like Tom Tillis, would they have been enthusiastic enough to come out to the polls and vote in a midterm?
I guess that's because we've had a lot of senators who just sort of put their head down and do the work and don't, cause a lot of stir, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, et cetera. Is that what it is, do you think?
Yeah, and what that means is that our Senate elections end up very much just sort of going whatever direction that the national political climates going. So just to, rapid fire run through them. 2008 was a great Democratic year, so we elected a Democratic senator. 2010 was a Republican wave year, so we voted Republican by double digits. 2014 was a good Republican year, so Tom Tillis beat Kay Hagan for re-election. 2016, Trump was winning the state by 4, so Burr won the state by 6. 2020, Trump just got over the top in the state. That got Tillis just over the top in the state. 2022, another good Republican midterm, Ted Budd wins. One thing that we don't talk about through all that is 2006 and 2018. Those were arguably the two best elections for Democrats in the state this century, but there was no Senate race. So what is kind of interesting this cycle is that we finally have a midterm with a Republican in the White House where we also have a Senate election. And that gives Democrats the best opportunity that they've had since 2008.
All right, so let's get into that before we get into the candidates then, since you brought that up. If the election was held today or this November, where do you think the situation would be? Obviously, as you mentioned, it should be a good year for Democrats historically in 2026. Trump has promised a lot of things that, a lot of people don't believe has come to fruition, whether it's wars or the economy. What do you think the situation is heading into 2026?
So we basically, in all of our polling across the country, are seeing a political climate that's moved about 5 or 6 points to the left from what happened last year. So what that means in a place like North Carolina that voted for Trump by 3 is you would sort of inherently expect a Senate race between just sort of like an average Democratic candidate and an average Republican candidate for Democrats to have about a 2-point advantage. That's sort of where we would expect to see things start out based on what we're seeing all across the country. And just one quick side note related to that, we've been so much under the impression that our congressional map could only come out either 11-3 for the Democrats, 11-3 for the Republicans, or 10-4 for the Republicans. But I think the 11th district in particular in the mountains, because of that movement of sort of the national political climate at 5 or 6 points to the left, I think that's actually coming onto the map as somewhere that could be competitive next year too. So we may end up having more than just the first district in the northeastern part of the state where we could have an interesting House race.
So interestingly in that, the typical Democrats have been very typical Democrats in the 11th district. Jamie Ager's getting in, who has a political family history there. His ad just came out, or his announcement video. He's in a flannel shirt and jeans sitting on a porch. He's a farmer. He's talking about very kind of moderate things, it seems like. Do you think that's intentional then, and that they think they can potentially win that race?
Yeah, I really do think that that's going to end up being somewhere that we're really talking about in October and November next year. And the other dynamic that we have going on in the mountains is they actually moved pretty well to the left last year, even as the state as a whole was moving to the right from 2020 to 2024. But places like Buncombe County and Henderson County and Transylvania County and all those sorts of places actually voted more Democratic than they did when Biden won. And that's sort of an interesting trend across North Carolina, is that in most of the country last year, everything just moved to the right. There's a lot of states where every single county in the entire state moved to the right. North Carolina had over 20 counties that moved to the left last year. And obviously it was, more like 80 that moved to the right. And that's why Trump won the state. But there was a lot more nuance in the results in North Carolina last year, where we saw some places actually shift in a more blue direction. And we didn't see that anywhere more vividly than in the mountains, which I really think is going to make this 11th district interesting. We haven't specifically done any polling there yet, but we've done some polling in other districts across the country that voted for Trump by like 10 or 12 points last year. And we're seeing those places competitive in this new political climate. That's kind of just par for the course in a midterm. Things really move in the direction of whichever party's out of power.
Interesting. All right. So let's get to my first dumb question. How important was it for Roy Cooper to run for Democrats in the race next year?
Well, it was important, but it was actually less important than I think the sort of common wisdom was. And it's no knock on Governor Cooper whatsoever, who certainly has proved to be a tremendous vote getter statewide in this century. But candidate quality effects have just been getting smaller and smaller across the country because things are driven so much more by the national political climate. The winner of the North Carolina Senate race is going to be determined much more by how people are feeling about Donald Trump than how they're feeling about Roy Cooper. So if you ask me what I honestly think, like the advantage of having him as opposed to, whoever else it would have been instead, I think it's a couple points. If you made me make a prediction today, 15 months out, I think that, as I alluded to earlier, you sort of have a generic 2-point Democratic advantage. And I think Roy Cooper's a strong enough candidate that you add another couple points to that. But we're still a 50-50 enough state that even with somebody who's a kind of a juggernaut like Governor Cooper, I still don't think he's going to win by more than about 4 points. Now, if we get to the point where the political climate would say that the Republicans would have a 1-point advantage if Trump ended up being surprisingly popular 15 months from now, then having Cooper in the race very well could be the difference between losing by a point and winning by a point. But it's not something where because Cooper's running, Democrats are going to win by 10 points. That's just not going to happen in North Carolina, unless the Republicans ran Mark Robinson, but that does not seem to be happening.
Well, there's still time. Who knows? All right, so let's go to the Republican side. So Michael Whatley, he's the RNC chairman, was the NC GOP chairman. He's never run for political office before. What do you think the difference is of him on the ballot with the Trump endorsement that he does have versus a Laura Trump if she chose to run?
I think that they'll do about the same. I think that there's more of a chance that Laura Trump would have imploded because of, having to move here at the last second and not having that substantive of a political background and that sort of thing. I think Whatley is very much just like a generic Republican. So I don't think that he's really going to do any better or any worse than sort of, just sort of a run-of-the-mill Republican candidate would do. I think the question for Republicans with Cooper in the race and with this likely pro-democratic political environment is if having a generic candidate is good enough for them. If it was, if Kamala Harris had been elected president and he was running, he would be favored because it would be a climate in which a generic Republican would be in good shape. But in the world that we're in, I think there's some argument that Republicans might have needed a candidate with sort of more of a history of being able to win elections, more of a personal dynamism, that sort of thing. I think it's hard for Republicans with sort of probably an average candidate, we'll see how it plays out, to beat Roy Cooper, who is clearly an above average candidate.
So does it, everyone's talking about his lack of name recognition versus Cooper's. In some ways, does it not really matter because it's just about a race about Trump?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. And, we saw last week the John Locke Foundation poll that came out with Cooper up by 8 points. I am sure that's correct at this point in time. I was telling people when Cooper announced last month that I thought that the polls would start out with him up by 8 or 10 points. But I think that's a little bit of an artificially inflated lead because basically what you're going to see in polls at this point is 95% of Democrats will be lined up behind Cooper because they know him. You might only see 85% of Republicans lined up behind Whatley, and a lot of them saying that they're undecided. But they will move into the Republican camp. The polls that you're seeing right now, the voters who are undecided are very much pro-Trump, pro-Republican sorts of voters who, once they become familiar with Whatley, will end up in the Republican column. So I basically would treat a poll where Cooper's up by 49 to 41 right now or something like that. I would sort of mentally think of that as being more like something that would end up at 52-48. I'd expect right now in the polls that 70% or so of the folks who are undecided will end up moving into the Republican column and giving us something that's more like the traditionally close races that we've come to expect in this state.
Well, so related to all this, so as you mentioned, the poll for Carolina Journal had it 47-39. Emerson has it 47-41, and there was a Victory Insights that had it at 3 percentage point difference. Republicans are out there saying, look, this is actually a good sign for Whatley. Cooper should be up by way more than that. Do they have a point or no?
Well, it's just North Carolina. I mean, even as popular as Governor Cooper was, he still only got reelected by about 4 or 5 points in 2020. So I think it's just hard to expect him to win by some super substantial margin. One thing that I think is important for people to remember is we talk about, how it's a Republican midterm, and that tends to be very good for Democrats. I think we've talked before about how sort of the best measure of true partisanship in North Carolina is how people vote for Court of Appeals, because there's nothing for them to go on other than the D or the R by the person's name. They're not voting based on the specific candidates at all. And in 2018, the last time we had a Trump midterm, Democrats still only won statewide 51-49. Democrats really just don't have a particularly high ceiling for sort of where they end up. You have to have something like we alluded to earlier with Mark Robinson for a Democrat to win statewide by much more than 2 or 3 points. So I think for Cooper and those two more recent polls where he was up by 6 or 8, I really just think that's about as good as a Democrat's going to be doing. So I don't really consider that a red flag for him. I just think it's a reality of the fact that it is going to be a close race. Cooper is not just going to, have a huge lead in the polls the whole time and coast to this thing. I think that he will likely win, but we're just not going to have a pro-Democratic blowout in the state, just as we haven't really had any pro-Republican blowouts in the state in recent years. We are on that thin line between which side comes out ahead 51-49.
So Sabato's Cristobal has it a toss-up, Cook Political Report toss-up, race to the White House, lean Roy Cooper, 270 to win, toss-up. You think it's a slight lean Cooper at this point, though? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the rating services tend to be a little conservative about going in either direction, and that's not a criticism. It's good for them to be measured like that. But I do think the race leans Democratic. That would be my assessment. And it's part of a more interesting national picture. I think at the start of this year, there was a school of thought that Democrats had no chance of winning back control of the Senate next year whatsoever. And it's certainly still a difficult path, but having North Carolina somewhere where they're favored to win, and then Democrats are still working on candidate recruitment in Maine, but Susan Collins has very poor approval ratings there. So those are sort of, to the extent you can call them low-hanging fruit, the sort of more low-hanging fruit states for Democrats to pick up a Senate seat. And then there's a lot of places that I would say look more interesting than you might have expected. Sherrod Brown just decided to run again in Ohio. In Iowa, Joni Ernst has really poor approval ratings. In Texas, Republicans are sort of having a civil war with each other. We found sort of soft approval numbers for Dan Sullivan in Alaska. We're seeing places where certainly Republicans are still favored to win, but there's a bunch of different places where Democrats maybe have like a 20 or 25% chance. And if they hit on 1 or 2 of those, there actually is a path for Democrats to get control of the Senate that it maybe didn't look like there was 7 months ago. And certainly, I think Cooper is at the front of that charge.
So does that potentially become a problem for Whatley financially if he does not keep the race within a couple points, that they may find themselves spending some money nationally elsewhere?
I still think that there's virtually unlimited money for North Carolina. That's sort of been the reality of our politics in recent years. I can't imagine this race getting to the point where it would get triaged. I think for better or worse, we are all going to be in for the ads all the way to November of 2026.
What do you think the difference would be then if Tillis stayed in against Cooper versus Whatley and these numbers that we're talking about?
I think the numbers would be exactly the same. I actually that Sunday that Tillis announced that he wasn't running again, the national media in particular was just making this huge deal about it, and how much it changed the calculus and that sort of thing. And I thought Roy Cooper was a modest favorite against Tom Tillis. We had him up by 4 points the last time that we polled it. And I think that Cooper is a modest favorite against Whatley now, too. So that was a case where I actually did not think that was a particularly politically seismic development. I think Democrats had a little bit of an advantage in the race when Tillis was still in it, and they still do now. The most interesting angle with Tillis, again, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is just whether Republicans are going to end up being more excited about Whatley than they were about Tillis, and the impact that that could have on turnout. We know that there's a lot of lower propensity Donald Trump voters, and they have fueled the Republican wins in the statewide in recent general elections. If a lot of those folks don't feel enthusiasm about the election without Trump in the picture this coming November, it'll be interesting to see not just the impact that that has on the U.S. Senate race, but if turnout's lower, that could really have an impact. We talked about the 11th district, but it also could really have an impact on how many state house and Senate seats Democrats can win. So much of the coverage about what's gone on in Raleigh over the course of the summer has been about whether Democrats have enough votes to uphold Governor Stein's vetoes or not. And if Republican enthusiasm is not that high next year, that could allow Democrats to get more of a cushion for being able to stop things that the governor doesn't want the Republicans in the legislature to do.
This is one of the most fascinating things about a post-Trump era that I think is fascinating for Republicans, right? He brought out so many people that hadn't even voted before, frankly, and they came out for Republicans. But I just wonder whether they will come out when Trump's not on the ballot. So what do you think about that? But also, he's obviously going to have money in his pulse on the races for at least a couple cycles, probably. But does that make a difference if his name is not on the ballot?
Yeah, it remains to be seen what's going to happen in a presidential year once we get past Trump. It's possible that if J.D. Vance or whoever takes over the mantle from him, that they'll be able to get out the same sort of coalition. But I definitely don't think that Trump has the ability to get the same sorts of voters out if he's not on the ballot for things like midterm elections and lower turnout elections. I think there's a very good chance Trump won North Carolina by 3 points last year. I think there's a very good chance that the people who actually vote next November will have voted for Kamala Harris in North Carolina. I think that you could have a situation where 70% of the people who voted for Harris come back out for the midterm, and only like 55 or 60% of the people who voted for Trump come back out for the midterm. So then you're in a situation where Democrats don't even really have to persuade that many Trump voters to vote Democratic. They'll just have a structural advantage from who votes and who doesn't. And we've seen across the country so far this year in special elections for a wide variety of offices or elections that are regularly scheduled in odd years that Democrats are overperforming how they did in those same places last November by an average of about 10 points. The most prominent one was the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. That was a place where Trump won in November, and then without him on the ballot, and even though his people were putting a huge amount of resources into the race, the Democrat won by 10 points because the Democrats showed back up for an election like that and the Republicans just didn't. It's not going to be as much of a drop off for a regularly scheduled November election like the midterm next year, but I think there'll definitely be some drop off. And I think that may play an even bigger role in the race than Trump people flipping. Basically, what we're seeing in our polls right now is not very many people are changing their side from last year. All but 1 or 2% of people who voted for Harris disapprove of Trump. It's not like Trump's winning anyone over. 6-7% of people who voted for Trump disapprove of him. So he is losing a few people, but not many. But I think a big key next year is just going to be who's motivated to come out and participate.
So everyone's talking about, like, okay, the Republicans in particular are saying, look, Cooper, he's had bad hurricane recovery, COVID times, he shut the state down, and they're hitting Watley for being a big oil guy and whatnot. But is the bottom line next year's all about a referendum on Trump for better, for worse, and some of that stuff probably won't matter at the end of the day?
I think that's pretty much the case. That it's just the reality of how midterms go, is that it's a referendum on how people feel about who's in power. And the only real exception this century, well, there were a couple. There were a couple midterm elections this century with a little more nuanced results than the usual expected outcome of just a wave for the party that's out of power. And the two things that sort of led to extenuating circumstances were, in the first Bush midterm in 2002, Republicans did a lot better than you would usually expect them to do because of George W. Bush getting some momentum for Republican candidates based on his leadership in the wake of 9/11. So that was one exception. And then in 2022, Democrats nationally didn't do quite as bad as you would expect them to do. They probably in North Carolina did do as bad as you would expect them to do. But nationally, because of Roe versus Wade getting overturned, that led to a big disparity in enthusiasm between the Democrats and Republicans, even more than you might expect, where Democrats did not lose as much in the midterm election as you would expect them to. So 9/11, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, those are the two events that have happened this century that led to a little bit more nuanced results in midterm elections than we usually have. I don't think anything has happened yet so far this cycle that would rise to the level of those two things and perhaps cause Republicans to do a little bit better in the midterm than history would usually suggest that they would do. But we still have 15 months for something like that to come along.
15 long months. So Trump and Republicans keep talking about, everything he's been doing is great. Obviously, they that's just the way they operate, and they talk about prices going down. Polls seem to be showing the opposite. And economists have great concerns that for Christmas and even shortly after then, that's when some of this tariff stuff will go into effect. Short of some major tariff deal that, reverses things completely, can that change for Republicans? Or are we kind of looking at now basically what the scenario is going to look like as we head into next year?
Well, I think that there's a lot of concern that the tariffs are really going to cause a lot of economic trouble. And if it turns out that that doesn't actually happen, then I think that small number of voters that is persuadable one way or the other might be a little bit more open to thinking that Trump's a good job and voting for Republican candidates. But certainly, I think where we stand right now, it seems more likely to go in the wrong direction with how things impact the economy than the right direction. And certainly beyond sort of like the overall issue of how people feel about Trump, the way that people are feeling about their personal economic situations is probably the next biggest thing that determines how people vote. And we certainly saw that last year. Democrats were very much the losers because of that. People were not happy with inflation and how things were going in their own household budgets and that sort of thing. And that ended up getting taken out on first Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris and Democratic candidates across the country. But the one difficult part about being in power is that now Republicans own all of that. So I think unless it turns out that the tariffs really do have a positive economic impact, and that's something that people are really feeling by next November, it is something that's probably going to hurt Republicans. One thing that I always go back to on that economy question is there was a very clear time in Joe Biden's entire 4 years in office where he had the worst approval numbers. And that was in July of 2022. Do you remember what happened in July of 2022?
Lord, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday.
$5 gas prices.
Oh.
We were finding Biden's approval in the 30s during $5 gas prices. That was what drove him down like nothing else. So, people are always asking me what could cause things to actually have a significant amount of movement. That was an example of something that really did cause a lot of people to sort of sour on what he was doing.
And sometimes feelings matter more than facts. Boy, do I hate saying that sentence as a journalist, but it's true, right?
Oh, it's unambiguously true. And we see that in sort of the questions that we ask people about how the economy's going. It's sort of like on January 10th, if you ask people how the economy was going, the Democrats said it was great and the Republicans said it was terrible. And then on January 30th, the Republicans said it was great and the Democrats said it was terrible. And obviously not a whole lot changed with the economy between January 10th and January 30th. But it is just a lot more tied up in tribalism and that sort of thing than actual sort of intellectually honest analysis of what's going on out there.
All right, one last question. It is a zoo out in there in redistricting world with Texas and now obviously potentially California. From your perspective of polling and how long you've been in politics, how wild is this and how big of a difference could this make next November?
Well, if Texas and California both do it, it's going to pretty much offset each other. But I think the very interesting question with California is then how many other Republican states decide that that gives them license to do it too. And Republicans have a lot more states where they can do it than Democrats do. So, if California does it and then Florida says, okay, we're doing it, and Missouri and Indiana and et cetera, there's ultimately more places for Republicans to gain by doing that. I certainly personally think that it's very bad for small d democracy and think that nobody should do it. But as a Democratic pollster, I think that Democrats cannot let themselves into a situation where one party fights hard and the other party doesn't. So I think that California is doing what it has to do. It's unfortunate that we've gotten to that point, though. And I also just think that all these uncompetitive districts are very unhealthy for the country as a whole. It's just going to be a smaller and smaller list of where voters actually have to try to appeal to both Democrats and Republicans. And that's going to mean that most members of Congress are going to be people who just could appeal to sort of the most extreme wings of their own parties, because we're getting to the point where just in a higher and higher percentage of districts, the primary is the election. The general elections are relevant. And we've seen that in our business in recent years. We're getting more and more primary work than we ever did in the past because there's so many competitive primaries, and we're getting a little bit less general election work than we did in the past because there's just not as many competitive districts across the country for Congress and state legislatures and that sort of thing. In 2022, at the end of June, we had our most revenue ever by a very wide margin. And I was like, oh, we're headed for, such a huge record year. And then the second half of the year wasn't that much bigger than the first half of the year because of there being so many fewer competitive districts.
Man, what a wild time we're living in. Tom, appreciate your expertise as always, my friend. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tim. Take care.
If you want to keep up with what's happening in North Carolina politics and hear more conversations with people shaping our state and beyond, subscribe to our channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues that matter to you.